In May of 2022, researchers at a Canadian lab called Citizen Lab typed 100,000 names into a search box over and over again from 3 different countries. They were not searching from Beijing, they were searching from Toronto, from cities across the United States, and from Canada. And what they found should have been front page news everywhere, because it revealed something that most people who think they have escaped big tech censorship have never fully understood. When users in the United States and Canada typed the name of a Chinese political dissident, or searched for the doctor who first warned the world about COVID-19 in Wuhan before he was silenced, or looked up the man known only as Tank Man, the lone figure who stood in front of a column of tanks leaving Tiananmen Square in 1989, the autosuggestions simply did not appear, not blocked with a message, not flagged as sensitive, just quietly, invisibly absent, as if those names barely existed on the internet at all. The search engine responsible was Bing, and the disturbing part is not that Bing censors inside China, where the company has openly admitted it must comply with Chinese law to keep operating there. The disturbing part is that this censorship was leaking out silently into search results, served to people in North America who had no idea Chinese political sensitivities were shaping what they could find in their own country. Now, here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. DuckDuckGo, the search engine millions of privacy-conscious people switched to specifically to get away from this kind of corporate control, uses Bing's auto-suggestion system. When Citizen Lab tested it, they found DuckDuckGo did not auto-suggest a certain Chinese leader's name either, the exact same gap that appeared on Bing itself. The people who fled to DuckDuckGo believing they had found independence from a single company's decisions were, without knowing it, still standing inside that same company's decisions the entire time. This is not a story about China. This is a story about you, about your search bar, and about a fact almost nobody has explained to you clearly. Stay with this, because once you understand what is actually happening every single time you type a query into your browser, you will never look at that little rectangle the same way again. Right now, on your phone or your laptop, you have a default search engine sitting there. And if you are the kind of person who pays attention to privacy, there is a good chance you switched away from Google at some point. Maybe you moved to DuckDuckGo because a friend told you it does not track you. Maybe you heard about Brave Search and made the jump. Maybe someone convinced you that Startpage was the smarter, more private choice. Millions of people have made exactly this move over the last several years. And most of them, myself included at one point, walked away from that switch genuinely believing they had escaped Google. That belief is only half true, and the half that is false is the half that actually matters. Switching your default search engine and actually escaping the infrastructure that controls what you can find online are 2 completely different accomplishments. One of them is easy. You click a few settings. The other one is nearly impossible because of a fact about the search industry that almost nobody explains out loud. When most people switch away from Google, they are not switching to an independent search engine. They are switching to a different interface sitting on top of the exact same underlying data. And once you understand what that means for the information you can access and for the decisions silently shaping what you see every single day, you cannot look at your search bar the same way again. So let's start with the number that explains everything else in this story. Of the hundreds of search engines available to you right now, only 3 have built their own independent index of the entire web. Only 3 organizations on the planet send out their own crawlers, store their own copy of the internet's content, and generate search results entirely from their own data. Those 3 are Google, Microsoft's Bing, and a quiet British company called Mojeek that most people, even people who work in technology, have never once heard of. Every single other search engine you have ever used or heard recommended, including the ones with tens of millions of daily users and enormous marketing budgets, is licensing search results from one of these 3 and building an interface on top. That is not opinion or speculation. That is the literal architecture of how search works in 2026. As of May 2026, Google holds just over 90% of all device search market share worldwide, according to the analytics firm StatCounter, while processing more than 5 trillion searches every single year, a figure the company itself only confirmed publicly in March of 2025, its first official update on search volume since 2016. Bing sits at roughly 3% globally and about 7% in the United States, propped up heavily by its Copilot AI integration and by being the unavoidable default across every copy of Windows and Microsoft Edge on Earth. Everything else you have ever used, every alternative you have seen praised in a privacy forum or a tech subreddit or a browser extension store, is quietly running on the infrastructure of one of those 2 companies, with only one genuine exception in the entire Western world. To understand why only 3 independent indexes exist, you need to understand what it actually costs to build one, and I do not mean that as an abstraction. I mean actual dollars and actual engineering scale. Indexing the web means deploying automated crawlers that travel across the entire internet continuously, following link after link, downloading and storing the content of every page they visit, and organizing all of it into a searchable database capable of returning relevant answers in a fraction of a second. The web right now contains an estimated 500 to 600 billion indexable pages, and it grows and mutates every single day. Running a crawler at that scale in 2026 costs organizations millions of dollars every month, with compute alone running between 1 and 5 cents per thousand pages crawled, bandwidth running between 5 and 12 cents per gigabyte, and storage costs stacking endlessly on top of both. Multiply that by hundreds of billions of pages and constant daily churn, and you start to understand that the barrier here was never really a technical one. It is a financial wall that only a small handful of organizations on the entire planet can climb. Alphabet, Google's parent company, raised its 2026 capital expenditure guidance to somewhere between $195 and $205 billion, reflecting the sheer scale of infrastructure required to maintain its dominance in search and AI at the same time. That figure covers far more than search alone, but it gives you a sense of the gravity of investment sitting underneath the results you see every time you open a browser. Google has spent more than 2 decades and tens of billions of dollars perfecting its crawling systems, its deduplication systems, its relevance ranking, and its spam detection. Microsoft has spent a comparable fortune building Bing over roughly the same stretch of time. These are not products a clever, well-funded startup can spin up in a garage over a few years. They are infrastructure projects on a scale that makes the 3-index reality feel almost inevitable once you actually see the economics laid bare. And yet most people who genuinely care about search privacy, most people who took the deliberate step of walking away from Google, are not thinking about any of this when they pick their replacement. They are thinking about the interface. They are thinking about the privacy policy sitting on the company's website. They are thinking about whether the name behind the search bar is tracking them or quietly selling their data to advertisers. All of that matters. But it sits downstream of a much harder question almost nobody ever asks: where are these results actually coming from? Answering that honestly is where this whole story gets uncomfortable, because for most of the privacy-branded search engines people rely on every single day, the honest answer is either Google or Microsoft. Never both, never neither. Always exactly one of the two, without exception. Take Startpage first, because Startpage users often feel they have made the smartest possible move, getting Google's results without Google's tracking attached. At one level, that feeling is completely justified. Startpage proxies every query to Google and hands you Google's results back, acting as an anonymizing wall between you and Google's servers. Your search history never lands in Google's hands because, from Google's point of view, the query originated from Startpage's servers, not from your device or your IP address. That privacy protection is real, and it is meaningful. But the results themselves are still Google's results, carrying every one of Google's decisions baked directly inside them, decisions about what content gets ranked, what content gets buried, and what content never makes the index in the first place. If Google has decided to demote or quietly remove a category of content from its index, you will never see that content on Startpage either, no matter how anonymous your query was on the way there. The privacy layer and the content access layer are two entirely separate questions, and Startpage only ever solves one of them. This is the distinction that almost never gets made when people talk about search alternatives, and it happens to be the one that matters most. If you believe you left Google by switching to a search engine that is still quietly pulling Google's or Bing's results underneath the hood, you solved a tracking problem, not an independence problem. Confusing the two gives you a false sense of information diversity that the actual infrastructure simply does not support. Now, what about Brave Search? This one is more interesting, to its credit, more honest than most of the alternatives out there. Brave Search runs a genuine index of its own and has been steadily improving its coverage and relevance, but as of 2026, it still operates as a hybrid, drawing partly from its own developing index and partly from Bing, with the share of independent results growing gradually as Brave's own crawling infrastructure expands. Brave has been transparent about running this hybrid model, which puts it well ahead of most competitors in terms of honesty. The company's trajectory is genuinely pointed toward full independence, and it deserves real credit for being one of the only organizations on Earth actively investing in something that does not ultimately trace back to Google or Microsoft. But right now, in 2026, a meaningful slice of what you see on Brave Search is still Bing underneath. The independence is real, but it is partial, and it is still a work in progress rather than a finished product. Ecosia leans hard into the environmental story, the tree planting donations attached to every search, and it has built a loyal following among people who want their browsing habits to carry a positive footprint. What Ecosia does not put front and center is that it is essentially Bing wearing a green interface with a charitable revenue model layered on top. The search results are Bing's. The index is Bing's. Every content decision embedded in those results traces back to Bing. The trees are genuinely real. The search independence is not. Yahoo Search runs on Bing too. Quant, The French search engine that spent years marketing itself as Europe's answer to American tech dominance leaned heavily on Bing during its most public growth years, and has had a genuinely complicated relationship with how independent it could honestly claim to be. The pattern repeats itself across the entire landscape without exception. The interface keeps diversifying. The underlying index never does. So let's talk about what this means at the level of actual content, because this is where index concentration stops being a technical curiosity and starts having direct, tangible consequences for what you can find when you search for something. Technical reviewers have documented that DuckDuckGo's search quality inherits the biases baked into Microsoft's Bing algorithm, including regional filtering, commercial prioritization, and content policies that ordinary users cannot see, cannot control, and cannot audit. When Bing makes a decision about how to handle a particular category of content, that decision does not stay contained inside Bing. It propagates instantly through every single search product built on top of Bing's index at the same time. A researcher relying on DuckDuckGo for privacy reasons might believe they are seeing a more neutral slice of the web than Google would give them, but if the content they are searching for has already been filtered out at the Bing index level itself, DuckDuckGo's privacy protections are completely beside the point. That filtering already happened before the query ever reached them. And this is not theoretical. Citizen Lab's own research documented exactly this happening, showing that Bing's censorship of politically sensitive Chinese names extended into autosuggestions served to users physically located in the United States and Canada, and that DuckDuckGo, because it draws its autosuggestions directly from Bing, inherited that exact same gap without ever independently deciding to create it. Microsoft eventually told Citizen Lab it had discovered and corrected what it called a misconfiguration. But the underlying dynamic that made it possible in the first place, one company's index shaping what an entire ecosystem of supposedly independent search engines can and cannot surface, remains exactly as true today as it was then. The users of DuckDuckGo, Ecosia, Quant, and every other Bing-dependent interface had no possible way of knowing that the gap in their own results originated at Microsoft's infrastructure level, rather than from anything specific to the product sitting in front of them. That opacity, the fact that you genuinely cannot tell where a missing result actually disappeared, is the part of this story that should concern anyone who thinks seriously about how they access information. Google generates approximately $307 billion in annual advertising revenue, making it the largest advertising platform the world has ever seen by a staggering margin. And since Google rolled out AI-generated overviews sitting directly above traditional search results, total search impressions have climbed roughly 49%, while click-throughs to the actual websites those results are supposedly pointing towards have fallen nearly 30% over that same stretch. That is the owner of the index making a unilateral decision to keep users trapped inside its own results page, rather than routing them out to the journalists, researchers, and publishers whose original work those results were built on in the first place. When Google makes that call, it is not only reshaping the experience of people who search directly on Google, it is reshaping the entire ecosystem of content creation that every other search engine, including DuckDuckGo and Startpage, ultimately depends on for there to be anything worth indexing at all. This is exactly why the existence of Mojeek matters so much more than its tiny market share would suggest. It matters because it stands as the only living proof that a genuinely independent search index is possible to build and sustain entirely outside the Google-Microsoft duopoly. Every argument claiming that true independence cannot be achieved at scale is quietly refuted by the simple fact that Mojeek exists, is fully operational, and has now been running for more than 20 years. Mojeek built its crawler and its index completely from scratch, does not license a single result from any third-party provider, stores no personal data whatsoever, no IP addresses, no search history, and maintains no connection between one search you run and the next. That specific combination, genuine independence paired with genuine privacy, does not exist anywhere else in the search landscape at any meaningful scale. But I want to be honest about the limitations here, because intellectual honesty is what separates real analysis from cheerleading. Mojeek's results are not at Google's level for every category of query. Testing shows Mojeek can lag noticeably on breadth compared to Google or Bing proxied engines, particularly for obscure or highly specific searches, where a smaller index inevitably creates gaps the larger players simply do not have. Search for something niche enough, something technical, something living in a small corner of the internet with few links pointing back to it, and there's a real chance Mojeek has not crawled that page yet, or has not weighted it with enough authority to surface it near the top. That is an honest limitation of a 5 billion page index competing against rivals with decades of additional investment and indexes many multiples larger. But here is the thing worth holding on to. The quality gap between Mojeek and the giants is a solvable engineering and investment problem. The independence question, whether a search engine is drawing on data it owns or data it borrowed, is a structural question that cannot be patched after the fact, You either own your index or you do not. Right now, in 2026, the only search engine outside of Google and Bing that genuinely owns its own index and makes it publicly available in the Western world is Mojeek. Running a search engine in 2026 is not remotely easy. Infrastructure costs have only continued climbing, which is precisely why almost no alternative search engine even attempts to build its own index in the first place. Mojeek doing it anyway, on a fraction of the budget its two giant competitors command, is either stubborn or visionary, depending entirely on how you choose to look at it. Then there is Kagi, which represents a genuinely different experiment in what search could look like once you remove advertising from the equation entirely. Kagi positions itself as a paid product built on a partly non-commercial index plus AI-generated instant answers, and its central argument is that this model produces results that are more consistent and far less ad-driven, because the revenue comes directly from subscribers rather than from advertisers bidding for your attention. Kagi draws from multiple sources, including its own developing index alongside Bing data, and users consistently report a noticeably cleaner signal-to-noise ratio than anything the ad-supported alternatives offer. The paid model is a real, meaningful departure from how search has operated for the last 2 decades, and the character of the results is genuinely different because of it. But Kagi is not a fully independent index yet, and its continued reliance on Bing for a portion of its results means it still shares some of the exact structural limitations running through this entire story. Meanwhile, the legal system in the United States has been forced to reckon with this same concentration. The Department of Justice's antitrust case against Google, which produced a landmark ruling that the company illegally maintained a monopoly in search, has continued moving through remedies proceedings that could force Google to share certain search data with competitors and end the exclusive default agreements that have locked its search engine into browsers and phones for years, changes that could genuinely begin reshaping search competition heading into 2027. That case is still working its way through appeals, and its final outcome remains genuinely uncertain. But the fact that it exists at all, that a federal court has formally acknowledged the scale of this concentration, tells you something important about where things actually stand. This is not a fringe concern confined to privacy forums anymore. It is a mainstream legal and regulatory acknowledgement that the three-index reality carries consequences reaching far beyond technology, straight into the economics of who gets to access information at all. Layered on top of all of this, AI-native search is now entering the picture and asking an entirely different question. Tools like ChatGPT search and Perplexity have captured a combined estimated share of queries that remains tiny in absolute terms, but is growing at a pace some analysts compare to Google's own early trajectory decades ago. Instead of indexing the web and handing you a list of links to click through yourself, these tools synthesize information pulled from across the web and hand you a finished answer instead. Google's own AI overviews are now present in roughly 48% of all tracked queries as of early 2026, up sharply from around 31% just a year earlier, and click-throughs to the original websites have kept falling by nearly 30% across that same window. The owner of the index is now also the one deciding how much of the web's content gets folded into an answer that keeps you sitting inside their platform, versus how much gets routed back out to the original source that actually did the work. That decision sits entirely inside the same three-index structure running through every part of this story, and its long-term implications for content creators, for publishers, and for the health of the open web itself are only beginning to come into focus. So what does mapping your own search dependency honestly actually look like? If you are using DuckDuckGo, you are on Bing. If you are using Startpage, you are on Google. If you are using Ecosia, Yahoo, or most of the other alternatives commonly recommended in privacy guides, you are on Bing as well. If your absolute top priority is privacy with minimal friction, DuckDuckGo or Startpage remain reasonable starting points, but understand clearly what you have actually accomplished. You have solved a tracking problem, not an independence problem. Those are two different goals entirely, and it matters enormously which one you are actually trying to achieve. Because optimizing for the wrong goal leaves you with a false sense of having addressed something you never actually touched. If what you genuinely care about is accessing a meaningfully different perspective on the web, content that Google's or Microsoft's algorithmic and policy decisions might not be surfacing for you at all, then right now the only options offering that are Mojeek, and to a growing but still partial degree, Brave Search. For pure structural independence, those are the two organizations positioning themselves outside the Google-Microsoft pipeline entirely. Mojeek hands you results from an index neither Google nor Microsoft had any hand whatsoever in building. Coverage will occasionally feel thinner on niche queries, and you will sometimes notice the gap compared to what you are used to seeing. But when you search on Mojeek, you are genuinely looking at a different slice of the internet, curated by entirely different algorithmic signals. And that difference is real in a way that switching between DuckDuckGo and Startpage fundamentally is not. A layered approach is probably the most honest recommendation anyone can give you here. For everyday queries, general knowledge, current news, product research, anything where coverage depth matters more than structural independence, Brave Search offers the best balance currently available, moving steadily toward independence while remaining transparent about exactly where it stands in that process. For queries, where you specifically want to see what a truly independent index surfaces, or you want to know whether content exists that Google and Bing simply are not showing you, Mojeek becomes the deliberate second pass, not your only tool, but a genuine check on topics where the major indexes may be carrying gaps or quiet biases. And for anything demanding Google-level comprehensiveness, where you're consciously willing to trade independence for raw coverage, Startpage at least strips the personal tracking layer out of that equation entirely. What should stop is pretending that switching your default engine to DuckDuckGo was ever by itself a meaningful act of independence from big tech's search infrastructure. It was a meaningful act of privacy protection, and that protection is real and valuable in its own right. DuckDuckGo genuinely does not build personal profiles tied to your searches, and genuinely does not use your history for advertising targeting. But calling that independence from the search duopoly was never accurate, and the tech world has let that inaccuracy quietly persist, largely because the honest version of this story is far more uncomfortable and demands more from all of us in terms of the choices we actually make and the products we actively choose to support. Here is the deeper thing worth sitting with once all of this settles. Google processes more than 8.5 billion searches every single day, more than every one of its competitors combined by a factor of 10, and that level of concentration in the infrastructure of human information access has no real precedent anywhere else in the history of media. When a newspaper editor makes a call about what to cover, that decision reaches the readers of that one newspaper. When Google makes a call about how to rank an entire category of content, that decision reshapes what is financially viable to publish across the whole internet, because the economic survival of content creators in nearly every field now runs through the algorithmic choices of a single company. With AI overviews now sitting inside nearly half of all tracked queries, and click-throughs down nearly 30% since that rollout began, the owner of the index is simultaneously extracting value from the web's content while quietly cutting off the traffic that made producing that content sustainable in the first place. That is a structural tension that does not resolve itself on its own, and its long-term consequences for the diversity and quality of information available on the open web are genuinely serious. The antitrust case working through the courts, the slow but steady growth of Brave's independent index, the stubborn 2-decade survival of Mojeek against every financial incentive telling it to give up, the emergence of subscription-funded models like Kagi that remove advertising from the picture entirely, these are all signals that the 3-index structure is not necessarily permanent. But none of them are moving fast enough or at nearly sufficient scale to change the fundamental architecture of search in the near term. The only realistic path toward a less concentrated search infrastructure runs directly through organizations like Mojeek that are willing to keep doing the expensive, unglamorous, multi-decade work of building and maintaining a genuinely independent index, choosing to support that kind of work, using their product, even when the results occasionally come back thinner than what Google would hand you, is one of the only concrete actions available to anyone who actually cares about this beyond the level of conversation. So the next time someone tells you they switched to DuckDuckGo for privacy, do not correct them on the privacy point, because they are right about that part. Ask them the follow-up question instead. Are you looking for privacy, or are you looking for independence? Because those are two different destinations, and right now, only one of them has a road that actually leads there. Knowing the difference is the bare minimum requirement for thinking clearly about the information reaching you every single day, and about the infrastructure quietly deciding what that information is allowed to contain.